Welcome to Clone Brewing, the YouTube channel where we brew clones of major commercial brewers. Today we're going to be brewing a Sierra Nevada Pale Ale as taken from the Brew Your Own Big Book of Clone Recipes. So before we start with the brewing, we're going to take a look at the recipe in the book and input our ingredients into Brewfather, and then we'll be back with the brew day. The Sierra Nevada Pale Ale is a 19 litre all grain batch. It has an expected original gravity of 1.052, an expected final gravity of 1.011. The IBUs are at 38, an SRM of 10, which roughly translates to around 19.7 EBC, and an expected ABV of 5.4%. In terms of ingredients, it calls for 4.6 kilograms of two-row pale malt and 300 grams of a caramel malt with 60 Lovibond, which roughly translates to around 158 EBC. In terms of hop additions, we're looking for pearl hops at 90 minutes, 14 grams, Cascade hops at 45 minutes, 28 grams, and 43 grams of Cascade hops at 0 minutes. It gives three different possible options for the yeast. Y yeast 1056 American Ale, White Labs WLP 001 California Ale, or Fermented Safale US 05, which I think we're going to use on this batch. It also advises to use 200 grams of dextrose for priming if you are going to be batch priming. But I think for us, we will be kegging and carbonating using CO2. In terms of the step-by-step guide, it recommends that you make a yeast starter a couple of days before the brew. Mash the grains in at 68 degrees Celsius. Mash out and then sparge at 77 degrees Celsius, looking to collect 25 litres of wort. Boil for 90 minutes, adding the hops at the times indicated, pitch the yeast and ferment at 20 degrees. Moving over to Brewfather, the first thing that we need to look at is to make sure that our batch size is correct. So you can see I have 19 litres in here, and we're also looking for a boil time of 90 minutes. So just make sure those two numbers are correct there. For this beer, I'm going to use Clear Choice Malt Extra Pale and also Crystal Light. Both of those are from Crisp. But you see when I put in 4.6 kilograms of this and 300 grams here, it actually gives me an ABV or an expected ABV of 6.4% and an expected original gravity of 1.060. That's well above where we want to be. We want to be at 1.052. So I'm going to scale this recipe to get to our intended original gravity. So by using that scale feature, it will reduce the amount of malt that we need in this brew. Moving over to the hop side, you'll see I've input the amounts exactly as called for in the recipe. However, this is giving us an IBU of 46, which again is above what we're looking for of around 38 IBUs. So again, I'm going to use this scale feature here, 38. And that's going to reduce some of our additions. It's reduced mainly our first addition to 6.3 grams. I'm just going to up that to 7 grams just to round it up. That brings us up to 39. Maybe I'll just take off a gram or two here. See, will that get us to 38? Yeah, so just a couple of little slight additions there just to get us to the correct IBU and also the correct original gravity that we're looking for. One thing I'm noticing here, it is dropping us down 2 points lower on the expected final gravity, giving us an ABV of 5.6%. Next, for the yeast, we're going to be using 1 packet of US 05. The fermentation profile as defined in the recipe, 20 degrees. I'm putting that in there for 10 days, but of course I can play around with that, and then cold crash afterwards for 2 to 3 days. Strike temperature 73.8 for a mash in of 68 degrees, and then a mash out at 77 for 10 minutes. In terms of our water profile, we're using reverse osmosis water. I'm going to let Brewfather do the calculations here on what I need for an American Pale Ale. That's the style I'm choosing in this little drop-down feature here. And then by clicking the auto button and saving the adjustments to my recipe, you'll see that requests 1.32 grams of calcium chloride, 2.13 grams of Epsom salt, and 4.41 grams of gypsum all into the match. And then 1.28 grams of calcium chloride, 2.07 of Epsom salt, and 4.29 into the Sparge. I'm also going to use a Whirlfloc tablet with 15 minutes remaining. And the recipe or Brewfather is calling for 14.03 litres of mash water and 13.65 of Sparge. Now that the planning and the recipe is all done, it's time to start brewing.
I have always preferred to mill my own grain, and to do so I use a grain mill called Grain Gorilla from Brew Farm. The setting that I use on my Grain Gorilla is a 0.045 grain crush, and I feel this gives me a good yield from my grain. To save a bit of time with this batch, I've ordered my grains in already pre-weighed out, so all I need to do essentially is cut the bag open, and pour into the grain mill. Good grain crush, not too fine and not too coarse. With the grain all milled, my next step is to weigh out my water additions. Now with the water additions all measured out and the strike temperature up to 73 degrees on the Grainfather, I'm going to bump that down to 68, which is where we're looking to get to, and start the mash in. So now that we're all mashed in, the final step is to attach the top plate. Just let that sit slightly above the grain bed. And attach the recirculation arm. So we're bang on 68 degrees. We're going to set the timer for 60 minutes. And start the pump. And we're away. With the mash moving along nicely, now is a good time to measure out my hop additions. Just a couple of minutes left of the mash out stage, but I wanted to show you the amazing clarity of this. Absolutely beautiful. So it's time for the sparge. We're just going to let this drain down a little bit, and I'm going to up the temperature here up to about 98 degrees. Whilst this flows through, the wort in the kettle will be heating up towards boil temperature. Sparge is finished. Actually, a really good sparge. Went through the grain bed like a hot knife through butter. We're up to our pre-boil gravity of about 25.3 litres. So now, next stage is I'm going to clean out the grain basket, although it's pissing rain outside, so I may hold off on that for a few minutes. You can probably hear that rain bashing off the roof. We're at 94 degrees, just about to get up to boil. And then we're going to set the timer for 90 minutes and add our first hop addition. I'd be interested to get people's opinion on this. So this wort has a lot of protein on the head, and I've always stored it back in, but I've seen some videos online where people will scrape off the protein off the top of the beer. So it'd be interesting to hear in the comments if there is a right way or a wrong way to do this. It's quite visible to see that we've hit our rolling boil, but my Grainfather is still registering this as 99 degrees. So I'm going to go ahead and set the timer for 90 minutes. And I'll also add my first hop addition, which is 7 grams of pearl. And just like that, it hits the boil. just before the boil started, I took a sample of the wort to get my pre-boil gravity, which I'm going to check now with the refractometer. So we're looking for a pre-boil gravity of 1.043. I think we're just slightly above where we need to be. 1.045 is what I'm seeing on that at the moment. So marginally above where we need to be. But that's fine. It's not too much difference. 1.043 to 1.045. We're in the ballpark of the numbers where we need to be. Time now for the 45-minute hop addition. And it's the 28 grams of Cascade. There's about 9 minutes left of the boil, so at this stage I am going to put the lid on and attach the counterflow wort chiller so I can recirculate through and sanitize or sterilize the chiller. So I'll do that for about 3 or 4 minutes and then take it off, put it aside until we're ready to transfer the wort into the fermenter. It's been on for about 3 or 4 minutes now, so turn off the pump. I'll let some of that flow back down into the pump there, and then I'll remove it. Just taking care, obviously, not to scald myself as I do. Just need to be careful when you're undoing the connection here because some hot wort will tend to spill out. Okay, so that's the 19 minutes finished. Turn off the heat. Add in my final hop addition. And give that a little bit of stir in. So now my final step is I'm going to whirlpool for maybe 2 to 3 minutes and then let that settle for 10 minutes before I begin the transfer into the fermenter. Okay, so I've reattached the counterflow chiller after waiting 10 minutes for all the hop matter to settle to the bottom, hopefully in a cone after that whirlpool. So the next step is to take out my temperature probe, insert it into the Grainfather watermeter so we can monitor the temperature of the transfer, and then I'm just going to hang this in here like that and start the pump. Now the transfer rate is at about 19 degrees at the moment, so it's a perfect time to take a sample. Well, that looks like it's spot on to me. We're aiming for 1.052 and hopefully you can see that. 1.052, bang on. Well, that's it. The transfer is complete. We're currently sitting at around 20.9 degrees Celsius. So still a bit early to pitch the yeast. What I'm going to do is hook the coolant pumps up to the fermenter and turn them on to get the temperature down to 20 degrees Celsius before we pitch. Just to check on our volume, I'm guessing roughly around about just over 19 litres, which is what we're aiming for into the fermenter. It literally took about a minute to change the temperature from 20.9 degrees Celsius, and it's actually after dropping it down so fast that it's gone down to 19 degrees Celsius, because the water and glycol mix that's pumping through that was set to a temperature of -4 degrees. So it's dropped it down to 19 degrees. I'm happy enough to pitch at 19 and let it just rise up naturally up to 20. So I have sanitized my scissors. And just pitch that directly in. And the next time we'll be back here, hopefully between 7 and 10 days or so, will be to keg this beer, and we'll do a pressure transfer from the Grainfather conical fermenter straight into one of my kegs, and then it'll be ready for carbonation with CO2. We're back, it's day 12, and we're about to do a pressure transfer from the Grainfather conical fermenter into the keg. So what's been happening over the last 12 days? Well, you can probably see on the screen just now, we started off at an original gravity of 1.052. We ended up at 1.012, slightly above where we were predicting, but that's fine. So we're ending up at an ABV of 5.3%. The recipe for the Sierra Nevada Pale Ale was predicting 5.4%. Brewfather was predicting 5.6%. So kind of a happy medium. 5.3% I think is more or less near to what the recipe was calling for. So we landed close to that. Next stage, as I said, is to transfer in, and then we're going to carb under CO2 pressure for probably 5 to 7 days before we do the taste test. So let's show you some of the footage of the pressure transfer. The first stage of the pressure transfer is to run some CO2 pressure at about 10 psi coming out of the bottle, and then that's controlled by this digital pressure transfer. It's about 2 psi, which is probably a little bit too high. You probably want it around about 1. That's pressure is going to push down to the out valve on the conical fermenter. You'll see that I've used a different fitting on this conical fermenter than the sampling arm that comes with it. So what I've used is a John Guest 38 PF to 38 male BSP, and that screws into where the sampling arm would, and then also a John Guest 38 PF elbow, piece of 38 tubing that comes into the keg, and this little device here is called a Kegland Duo-Tight Flow Stopper. Essentially it stops you overfilling a keg. I don't think we're going to have 19 litres in this batch to fill, but it does allow CO2 out, so as the pressure is going into the keg and the liquid is going into the keg, that'll allow the CO2 to escape for a seamless transfer. So let's get it going. Time has come for the taste test between the Sierra Nevada Pale Ale and the clone recipe. Just a couple of things to point out before we do the taste test. I recently noticed that Sierra Nevada Pale Ale is now actually 5% ABV. The recipe we were brewing was aimed towards 5.4% ABV, which was the previous ABV on Sierra Nevada Pale Ale. We came in at around about 5.3%, so some slight differences there. Another thing to clarify as well, it's quite difficult to get really fresh Sierra Nevada Pale Ale in Ireland. It tends to arrive here a long time after it's brewed, so there's always some issues around freshness. So we'll see. Okay, let's do the test. Okay, so first impressions. The colour is similar between both. I would say my clone version is slightly on the darker side, but very, very similar. In terms of head, kind of fluffy, just off-white head on both of these beers. The actual Sierra Nevada Pale Ale from the can, and also the clone recipe. So we'll begin with the Sierra Nevada Pale Ale. In terms of aroma, there's not huge hop aroma off that. What I am getting is a little bit of maybe pine. Yeah, it's not kind of bursting through in terms of the aroma. And the clone, yeah, very similar, even less I would say, so more subdued on the clone, less aroma, but a hint of pine as well. So let's go for the taste. Again, quite subdued, and I'm not sure if that's down to the lack of freshness by the time this beer arrives into Ireland. But I've heard it described in the past as a hoppy beer. I certainly wouldn't describe this as a hoppy beer. It's definitely more subdued. Slight little bit of bitterness in there as well. And now for the clone, how does that match up? The similarities, but there's quite a few differences as well. A little bit more of a malty character to the clone. Definitely not the same level of bitterness either. Still a nice beer. Okay, so how would I describe the comparison between the two? There's definitely more going on in the Sierra Nevada Pale Ale. It has a little bit more aroma, slight little bit more bitterness, a little bit more flavour. The clone is a good solid beer. More malt character comes through than hop, which I wouldn't expect from a pale ale. However, it's still a fairly solid beer, but would somebody know the difference between the two of them? I think they would. I don't think they're that similar that you would classify these as perfect clones. But all in all, a really nice beer, very drinkable. A good solid pale ale. I'd like to actually try that recipe, maybe add more hops in there. It's a good solid base pale ale recipe, so it could definitely be hyped up a bit with a little bit more hops, or maybe some dry hops in there as well. So that's the taste test. Hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please like and subscribe to the channel. We'll have more great content coming your way quite soon. Thanks for watching.